This extensive analysis examines a significant intellectual exchange regarding approaches to social justice reform, judicial philosophy, and the relationship between incremental institutional change and direct confrontational advocacy. The discussion explores fundamental questions about how democratic societies achieve meaningful progress on civil rights, gender equality, and systemic reform. The case study presented here illustrates tensions between different generations of advocates, varying strategic approaches to achieving justice, and the complex interplay between working within institutional frameworks versus challenging them from outside. It raises critical questions about the role of civility and advocacy, the value of cross-ideological dialogue, and whether patient legal strategy or urgent direct action proves more effective in advancing social change. This analysis will examine these themes through multiple lenses: constitutional theory, social movement history, generational perspectives on activism, professional ethics in public discourse, and the long-term effectiveness of different advocacy strategies. Part 1. Theoretical Foundations. Chapter 1. Frameworks for Understanding Social Change. The architecture of institutional reform social change in democratic systems occurs through multiple mechanisms operating simultaneously at different levels of society. Understanding how these mechanisms interact provides essential context for evaluating different advocacy approaches. Primary mechanisms of social change. Legal precedent building represents one fundamental approach. This strategy involves identifying test cases that can establish favorable legal principles, then building upon those principles in subsequent litigation. Each successful case creates binding authority that courts must consider in future disputes, gradually expanding protections and rights through accumulated precedent. The strategic advantages of this approach include creating legally enforceable protections rather than merely aspirational goals building, institutional legitimacy by working within established constitutional frameworks, enabling incremental progress even when broader political support is lacking, establishing foundations that subsequent advocates can build upon, forcing opponents to engage with legal reasoning rather than political rhetoric. However, this approach also faces significant limitations. Progress occurs slowly, often requiring decades to achieve substantial change. Success depends on convincing judges who may hold opposing philosophical views. Each case must be carefully selected to avoid creating negative precedent. Legal victories can be reversed by subsequent courts or legislative action. The technical nature of legal argument may not inspire or mobilize broader movements. Direct political action represents a contrasting approach. This strategy emphasizes public demonstrations, electoral pressure, legislative advocacy, and direct challenges to existing power structures. It seeks to create political conditions that make reform necessary rather than persuading individual decision-makers. The strategic advantages of this approach include ability to mobilize large numbers of people around shared grievances, creating public awareness of injustice that legal proceedings may not generate, applying direct pressure to elected officials who respond to constituent demands, shifting public opinion and cultural norms, surrounding contested issues, demonstrating urgency and refusing to accept gradualist timelines. This approach also faces distinct challenges. Political gains can be reversed when electoral coalitions shift. Confrontational tactics may alienate potential allies and moderate supporters. Success requires sustained mobilization that can be difficult to maintain. Achievements may lack legal enforceability if not translated into binding Law opponents can characterize movements as radical or unreasonable, cultural. Transformation represents a third mechanism operating alongside legal and political change. This involves shifting societal attitudes, challenging prevailing narratives, and changing how communities understand contested issues. Cultural change strategies include media representation that normalizes previously marginalized identities, educational initiatives that challenge historical narratives, personal relationship building that humanizes abstract policy debates, artistic expression that makes injustice emotionally resonant, influencing language and discourse surrounding contested issues, yet inati. Relationship between these mechanisms is complex. Legal victories without cultural support may remain unenforced or create backlash. Cultural change without legal protection remains vulnerable to political reversal. Political mobilization without legal strategy may achieve temporary gains that prove unsustainable. The most effective social movements typically employ all three mechanisms simultaneously, with different actors and organizations specializing in particular approaches while recognizing their interdependence. Not all criticism of judicial decisions threatens institutional independence. Distinguishing legitimate from problematic criticism helps maintain healthy democratic discourse. Legitimate forms of criticism include substantive analysis of legal reasoning, examines whether opinions correctly interpret constitutional text, apply precedent appropriately, and reach logically sound conclusions. This type of criticism accepts courts' legitimate role while questioning whether specific decisions fulfill that role properly. Scholarly critique in law reviews and academic publications provides detailed analysis of jurisprudential approaches, identifies tensions within doctrine, and proposes alternative interpretations. This contributes to legal discourse that ultimately influences future judicial thinking. Legislative responses to judicial decisions represent appropriate democratic checks. When courts interpret statutes in ways Congress didn't intend, legislation can clarify meaning. When courts strike down laws as unconstitutional, constitutional amendments provide democratic remedy. Advocacy for different judicial appointments represents legitimate democratic participation. Citizens can support candidates who will appoint judges with different jurisprudential philosophies, working within constitutional appointment processes. Problematic criticism includes attacking judicial legitimacy based on disagreement with specific decisions suggests courts should rule based on desired outcomes rather than legal analysis. This undermines public confidence in judicial neutrality, essential for maintaining rule of law. Personal attacks on judges for decisions rendered in official capacity conflate judges' personal views with legal analysis. Judges must follow law and precedent even when personally disagreeing with outcomes. Personalizing criticism makes it harder for courts to issue unpopular but legally required decisions. Threatening institutional reforms designed to influence pending or future litigation effectively constitutes political pressure on courts. While structural reforms may be appropriate for genuine governance reasons, proposals timed to affect specific cases threaten independence. Mischaracterizing judicial role by suggesting courts should prioritize policy outcomes over legal analysis fundamentally misunderstands separation of powers. Courts interpret and apply law, legislatures create it. Criticism that ignores this distinction undermines constitutional structure. 4.3. Special considerations for lawyers and public office attorneys who enter legislative or executive roles face particular professional responsibilities regarding public discourse about courts. Model rules of professional conduct impose obligations on lawyers that persist even when serving in other capacities. Rule 8. 2 addresses judicial criticism, prohibiting lawyers from making statements about judges' qualifications or integrity that the lawyer knows to be false or makes with reckless disregard for truth. While allowing robust criticism, it requires factual accuracy. Rule 8.4 prohibits conduct prejudicial to the administration of justice. While not clearly defining boundaries, this suggests lawyers should avoid rhetoric that materially undermines public confidence without factual foundation. Sedate bar disciplinary. Authority remains applicable to lawyers serving in public office, though First Amendment protections limit sanctions for political speech. Courts have generally held that lawyers retain free speech rights while also maintaining heightened professional obligations. Leadership responsibilities mean lawyers in public office should model appropriate democratic discourse. Their legal training presumably gives them special understanding of institutional roles and separation of powers principles. Public education opportunities allow lawyers in legislative positions to help constituents understand judicial function, constitutional structure, and appropriate ways to respond to unpopular decisions. Part 5. The Value of Cross-Ideological Dialogue. Chapter 5. Friendship Across Philosophical Divides. 1. The Ginsburg-Scalia Friendship as Case Study. The friendship between Justice Ginsburg and Justice Antonin Scalia represented perhaps the most famous example of genuine relationship across deep ideological disagreement. Understanding this friendship requires examining both its nature and its broader significance. Personal relationship characteristics. The two justices shared genuine affection despite disagreeing on nearly every contentious legal issue. They spent New Year's Eve together annually, attended opera performances, vacationed with their families, and maintained close personal contact outside official duties. Their professional relationship involved serious intellectual engagement. Scalia would circulate draft opinions to Ginsburg before other justices, seeking her critique to strengthen his reasoning. Ginsburg reciprocated, treating Scalia as her toughest critic whose challenges improved her work. They demonstrated public respect for each other's intelligence and integrity while disagreeing completely about jurisprudential approach. Neither suggested the other was motivated by improper considerations or lacked genuine constitutional commitment. Common critiques of such friendships. Critics argue that personal friendships across ideological lines normalize views that cause real harm to vulnerable populations, treat questions about human dignity as mere intellectual debates, privilege personal relationships over principled solidarity with affected communities, create pressure to soften criticism of harmful positions, demonstrate insufficient urgency about injustice, suggest that maintaining personal comfort matters more than fighting oppression. These critiques raise important questions about when and how to engage with those holding opposing views. Defense of cross-ideological friendships. Advocates for such friendships argue they create opportunities for private persuasion, impossible in public confrontation, model democratic norms of engaging with opponents respectfully, demonstrate that disagreement, doesn't require personal hostility, enable better understanding of opposing views that improves advocacy. Maintain institutional functionality by preventing personal animosity. Allow for complex humanity rather than reducing people to single positions. 2. Strategic value of engagement. Beyond personal friendship, strategic engagement with opponents serves several advocacy functions. Understanding opposition requires genuine dialogue. Effective advocacy depends on accurately understanding opponents' actual views rather than caricaturing them. Direct engagement provides insights that improve persuasive strategies. Identifying movable middle becomes possible through relationship building. Some opponents hold positions based on limited information or assumptions that can be challenged through personal engagement. Confrontational approaches foreclose these opportunities. Institutional functionality in deliberative bodies depends on ability to work across disagreement. Legislatures, courts, and other governing institutions cannot function if personal hostility prevents communication and negotiation. Marginal persuasion affects outcomes even without changing fundamental views. In the judicial context, convincing an opposed justice to soften language in an opinion, remove particularly harmful dicta, or narrow the ruling's scope can matter tremendously even without changing the basic outcome. Legitimacy maintenance requires that institutions command respect from people across political spectrum. When actors within institutions demonstrate mutual respect despite disagreement, it reinforces perception that deliberation occurs in good faith rather than pure power politics. 5.3 Limits and Boundaries. While cross-ideological engagement offers strategic value, important boundaries must be maintained. Non-negotiable principles exist where compromise becomes complicity. Questions involving basic human dignity, fundamental rights, and core values may not be appropriate subjects for friendly disagreement. The line between strategic engagement and normalization of oppression requires careful navigation. Power asymmetries affect whether engagement serves justice. When those directly experiencing oppression engage with those wielding power over them, friendly dialogue may obscure genuine power dynamics and pressure victims to make their oppression comfortable for oppressors. Public versus private engagement contexts matter significantly. Private relationship building may enable persuasion, while public friendship can send problematic signals about normalizing harmful views. Opportunity costs of engagement must be weighed. Time and energy spent on relationship building with unlikely allies might be better invested in mobilizing supporters or building grassroots power. Emotional labor required for such engagement often falls disproportionately on marginalized groups, who must engage politely with those denying their humanity. Part 6. Dissents and Their Significance. Chapter 6. The Role of Judicial Dissent. Understanding. Dissenting opinions. Judicial dissents serve multiple functions within legal systems. Immediate functions in case context. Force majority to address. Strongest counter-arguments. Provide alternative legal analysis for parties to cite in future cases. Signal to losing litigants that their position received serious consideration. Create record of disagreement that may influence settlement of related disputes. Sharpen majority's reasoning by requiring engagement with criticism. Precedential value for future litigation. Provide roadmap for distinguishing or limiting majority holdings. Offer alternative interpretive frameworks that future courts may adopt. Identify weaknesses in majority. Reasoning that subsequent cases may exploit. Suggest potential constitutional or statutory arguments. Signal which justices might be persuadable in related cases. Communicative function beyond legal community. Educate public about contested legal issues and competing interpretations. articulate principles and values for broader social movements, provide moral and intellectual foundation for continued advocacy, demonstrate that current doctrine isn't inevitable or natural, inspire future generations of lawyers and advocates, institutional role within judiciary. Maintain interpretive flexibility by preventing constitutional meaning from appearing settled. Enable evolution of doctrine over time as dissents become majority views. Protect individual judicial conscience by allowing expression of disagreement, model thoughtful engagement across philosophical differences. Maintain plurality of voices within institutions. 2. Famous dissents that became law history provides numerous examples of dissenting opinions that ultimately prevailed. Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, upheld racial segregation under separate but equal doctrine. Justice Harlan's lone dissent argued that our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. Though rejected at the time, Harlan's dissent provided moral and legal foundation for civil rights advocates who eventually achieved Brown v. Board of Education's reversal of Plessy 58 years later. Lochner v. New York, 1905, struck down labor regulations as violating freedom of contract. Justice Holmes's dissent argued that the 14th Amendment does not enact Mr. Herbert Spencer's social statics, and that legislatures must have room to experiment with economic regulation. Holmes's dissent eventually prevailed when the court abandoned Lochner-era substantive due process in the 1930s. Olmstead v. United States, 1928, held that wiretapping without physical trespass didn't constitute Fourth Amendment search. Justice Brandeis's dissent argued that the Constitution must protect privacy against advancing technology. The makers of our Constitution sought to protect Americans in their beliefs, their thoughts, their emotions, and their sensations. Brandeis's view ultimately prevailed in Katz v. United States, 1967. These examples demonstrate that dissents plant seeds for future doctrinal development, even when immediately unsuccessful. 6.3. Contemporary dissents as advocacy tools. Recent dissents have taken on increased significance in polarized times. Shelby County v. Holder, 2013, struck down Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act. Justice Ginsburg's dissent comparing this to throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet became rallying cry for voting rights advocates. The dissent provides legal framework that lower courts and future litigants cite in challenging restrictive voting laws. Burwell v. Hobby Lobby, 2014, held that closely held corporations could claim religious exemptions from contraceptive mandate. Justice Ginsburg's dissent warned about implications for other discrimination claims and has influenced subsequent litigation about scope of religious exemptions. Shelby County dissent's cultural impact extended beyond legal doctrine. The memorable phrasing made complex legal issues accessible to general public, helping mobilize political opposition to voting restrictions. Legal advocacy organizations incorporated dissent's reasoning into legislative campaigns and public education efforts. This demonstrates how effective dissents function simultaneously as legal documents, political statements, and cultural texts that resonate beyond courtrooms. The exchange examined in this analysis illustrates fundamental tensions in democratic advocacy between patience and urgency, persuasion and confrontation, working within institutions and challenging them from outside. Rather than resolving these tensions in favor of single approaches, The most sophisticated understanding recognizes that productive tension between different strategies strengthens movements overall. Success requires both the architects who build incrementally and the visionaries who demand transformative change. Both the inside reformers who understand institutional dynamics and the outside agitators who refuse to accept current arrangements. Democratic systems function best when multiple voices employing different strategies engage in ongoing dialogue about means and ends, principles and pragmatism, immediate needs, and long-term sustainability. The lesson is not that any particular approach is correct while others are mistaken, but that movements require strategic diversity, generational learning, contextual adaptation, and mutual respect across tactical differences. Those committed to justice must employ patience when patience serves goals, and urgency when urgency is required, confrontation when confrontation proves necessary, and persuasion when persuasion works better, principle when principle matters most, and pragmatism when pragmatism enables progress. This integrative approach honors both the architects and the visionaries, recognizing that lasting social transformation requires contributions from advocates employing all approaches across multiple generations. Part 2. Generational Perspectives on Advocacy. Chapter 2. Evolution of Feminist Legal Strategy. Historical context of gender discrimination in law understanding. Contemporary debates about advocacy strategy requires examining the legal landscape that earlier generations of feminists confronted. Legal status of women in mid-20th century America. When feminist legal advocates began systematic challenges to gender discrimination in the 1960s, 1970s, American law contained extensive explicit discrimination. Employment discrimination was legal and widespread. Want ads openly specified men only or women only for job positions. Employers could legally fire women for becoming pregnant. Many professions explicitly excluded women or imposed quotas limiting female participation. Women were paid less for identical work without legal recourse. Credit and financial access was restricted. Banks routinely required married women to have their husbands co-sign for credit cards or loans. Single women faced even greater barriers. Women could not establish independent financial identities. Educational opportunity was limited. Many universities imposed quotas on female students. Professional schools openly excluded women or maintained separate, inferior programs. Public universities could reject female applicants explicitly because of their gender. Jury service was restricted in many states. Women were either excluded entirely or made subject to different rules than men, based on assumptions about their proper domestic roles. Family law reflected coverture principles. Married women lost independent legal identity. Husbands controlled marital property and made decisions for the family unit. Divorce laws often disadvantaged women economically. Criminal law failed to protect women in multiple areas. Marital rape was legal in all states. Sexual harassment had no legal recognition. Domestic violence was treated as private family matter rather than criminal conduct. Constitutional law provided little protection. The Supreme Court had never recognized gender as a suspect classification requiring heightened scrutiny. The 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause was interpreted to permit nearly all gender classifications. This legal landscape meant that formal equality existed nowhere in American law. Gender discrimination was not aberrational or exceptional. It was fundamental to legal structure. Strategic litigation campaigns. Faced with this comprehensive legal discrimination, feminist advocates developed systematic litigation strategies to achieve constitutional transformation. The ACLU Women's Rights Project, founded in 1972, the Women's Rights Project represented the most sophisticated legal strategy for challenging gender discrimination. The project's approach involved several key elements. Careful case selection meant identifying disputes that presented gender discrimination in its clearest, most sympathetic forms, rather than beginning with the most difficult issues. Strategists sought cases where even conservative judges would recognize inequality as unjustifiable. Strategic sequencing involved building precedent gradually. Early cases established that the Constitution required some scrutiny of gender classifications. Subsequent cases pushed courts to apply increasingly rigorous scrutiny. Each victory provided foundation for the next case. Plaintiff diversity was carefully considered. Early cases often featured male plaintiffs challenging discrimination against men, demonstrating that gender stereotypes harm everyone. This approach made it harder for judges to dismiss the issue as special pleading by women. Narrative framing emphasized how discrimination harmed families and society broadly, not just women specifically. This made the issue more palatable to judges, who might resist arguments framed in terms of women's liberation. Amicus briefs from respected organizations provided additional support and demonstrated broad consensus that gender discrimination should receive constitutional scrutiny. Landmark cases. Reed v. Reed, 1971. Challenged an Idaho law automatically preferring men over women as estate administrators. The case presented clear discrimination without complications. The Supreme Court unanimously held that gender classifications must have rational basis, marking the first time the court struck down a law for gender discrimination under the Equal Protection Clause. Frontiero v. Richardson, 1973. Challenged military benefits rules that automatically provided allowances for male service members' spouses, but required female service members to prove their spouse's dependency. 4 justices concluded that gender should be treated as a suspect classification like race, requiring strict scrutiny. Though this didn't achieve majority support, it moved constitutional law significantly toward heightened scrutiny for gender. Weinberger v. Wiesenfeld, 1975, involved a widowed father denied survivor benefits available to widowed mothers. The unanimous decision recognized that gender stereotypes harm both women and men, with Justice Brennan noting the classification unjustifiably discriminate against women wage earners. Craig v. Boren, 1976, established that gender classifications must meet intermediate scrutiny. They must serve important governmental objectives and be substantially related to achieving those objectives. This landmark established the constitutional standards still applied. Today, United States versus Virginia, 1996, held that the Virginia military institutes male-only admission. Policy violated the Equal Protection Clause. Justice Ginsburg's majority opinion established that gender classifications must meet an exceedingly persuasive justification and cannot rely on overbroad generalizations about the different talents, capacities, or preferences of males and females. Each of these cases built upon foundations established by predecessors. The patient accumulation of precedent gradually transformed constitutional law from permitting nearly all gender discrimination to requiring substantial justification for gender classifications. Q223, critiques and limitations. While this litigation strategy achieved remarkable constitutional transformation, it also faced significant critiques. Slow pace meant decades passed before substantial legal change occurred. During this time, discrimination continued affecting millions of women. Limited reach of constitutional law meant victories primarily affected government discrimination. Private sector discrimination required separate legislative approaches. Formal equality focus meant cases challenged explicit legal classifications but couldn't easily address systemic discrimination operating through facially neutral policies. Elite focus meant professional lawyers and judges drove strategy, potentially limiting input from women experiencing discrimination most severely. Compromise, inherent in litigation, meant accepting partial victories and building on them gradually, rather than achieving comprehensive transformation. Contemporary feminist legal scholars debate whether alternative approaches might have achieved more just outcomes more quickly, or whether working within existing constitutional structures was necessary to achieve sustainable change. 1.2 Historical precedents for strategic diversity examining. Successful social movements reveals that strategic diversity, employing multiple approaches simultaneously, consistently, proves more effective than single strategy. Movements. The civil rights movement provides perhaps the clearest illustration of strategic diversity's power. The movement succeeded not through a single approach but through careful coordination of multiple strategies. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund, led by Thurgood Marshall, pursued systematic litigation challenging segregation laws. Beginning with graduate education cases where inequality was most obvious, they built precedent gradually until Brown v. Board of Education could successfully challenge segregation in primary education. This patient legal strategy established constitutional principles that remain binding today. Simultaneously, grassroots organizers like Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, and countless local activists built community organizations, registered voters, and created sustainable infrastructure for long-term political engagement. Their work transformed political power structures in ways that legal victories alone could not achieve. Direct action campaigns led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee applied urgent pressure through boycotts, sit-ins, and marches. These actions created political crises that forced national attention and made the status quo untenable. Cultural workers, including James Baldwin, Maya Angelou, and Sidney Poitier, challenged prevailing narratives and humanized the struggle in ways that reached Americans who might not engage with legal arguments or political organizing. These strategies operated in tension at times. NAACP lawyers sometimes worried that direct action campaigns would create hostile judicial environments. Grassroots organizers occasionally felt legal strategies moved too slowly and served elite interests. Direct action advocates pressed for urgent confrontation while others counseled patience. Yet this creative tension strengthened the movement overall. Legal victories provided concrete achievements and constitutional foundations. Political organizing built lasting power structures. Direct action created urgency and national attention. Cultural work shifted hearts and minds. No single strategy alone would have achieved the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, and constitutional transformations that emerged from this era. Success required all approaches working simultaneously, even when individual advocates disagreed about tactical priorities. The women's rights movement similarly employed strategic diversity across multiple generations. First-wave feminists pursued constitutional amendment through decades of political organizing, culminating in the 19th Amendment. This required building state-by-state coalitions, persuading male legislators, and sustained commitment across generations. Second-wave feminists in the 1960s, 1980s combined legal strategy through organizations like the ACLU Women's Rights Project with grassroots consciousness raising, direct action campaigns, and cultural transformation through publications like Ms. Magazine. Contemporary feminism continues this pattern, employing litigation, legislative advocacy, electoral politics, social media campaigns, and cultural production simultaneously. Each generation built upon foundations laid by predecessors while adapting to new challenges and opportunities. Progress occurred through accumulation of multiple strategies over extended time periods. LGBTQ rights movements demonstrate similar patterns. Legal organizations like Lambda Legal pursued strategic litigation. Grassroots groups built community infrastructure and provided services. Direct action groups like ACT UP created urgent pressure around the AIDS crisis. Cultural figures in entertainment and media normalized LGBTQ identities. The movement achieved landmark victories including Lawrence v. Texas and Obergefell v. Hodges through patient legal strategy building on precedents established over decades. Simultaneously, political organizing changed electoral calculations and direct action created public awareness. Theoretical debates: incrementalism versus transformative change. Political theorists and social movement scholars have long debated whether incremental reform or transformative rupture proves more effective in achieving justice. Incrementalist perspectives. Proponents of incremental change emphasize several key arguments. Institutional stability matters because societies cannot function without predictable governance structures. Radical disruption may achieve temporary gains but risks creating chaos that ultimately harms vulnerable populations most severely. Gradual reform allows institutions to adapt while maintaining essential functions. Coalition building requires persuading people who don't initially support your goals. Incremental approaches allow moderates to support limited reforms, building momentum for subsequent change. Demanding immediate transformation may alienate potential allies and create political isolation. Sustainability of reforms depends on broad acceptance. Changes imposed rapidly without building social consensus face higher risk of reversal when political conditions shift. Patient persuasion creates more durable transformation. Practical constraints exist within legal and political systems. Constitutional structures, legislative procedures, and judicial precedent create real barriers that cannot be wished away. Effective advocacy must work within these constraints while pushing boundaries. Unintended consequences of rapid change can undermine intended goals. Careful, incremental reform allows time to assess impacts and make adjustments before proceeding further. Transformative change perspectives. Critics of incrementalism raise equally compelling concerns. Urgency of suffering means gradual approaches accept continuing harm to real people. When lives are at stake, counseling patients becomes morally problematic. Justice delayed is justice denied. Power structures resist change and will offer minimal concessions to diffuse movements without surrendering fundamental advantages. Incremental reform may serve to legitimize and strengthen oppressive systems rather than transforming them. Windows of opportunity exist during moments of political possibility. Movements that seek incremental change may miss opportunities to achieve transformative victories when public attention and political will align. Normalization of injustice occurs when movements accept existing frameworks as legitimate starting points. This can make structural critique impossible and limit imagination about alternatives. Moral clarity requires uncompromising demands for justice rather than accepting compromise. Positions that leave fundamental injustices in place. The debate between these perspectives cannot be resolved in the abstract because optimal strategies depend on specific contexts, the nature of injustice being addressed, existing political conditions, available resources, and characteristics of opposition faced. Most successful movements employ both incrementalist and transformative elements simultaneously, with different actors specializing in each approach while maintaining strategic coordination.